Good afternoon. Welcome to the fifth virtual hearing of the Penn Public Safety Review and Outreach Initiative. I'm Dorothy Roberts, a Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor of Africana Studies, Law, and Sociology, and I, along with Reverend Chaz Howard, are leading this initiative as appointed advisors to Penn President Amy Gutmann. Reverend Howard will introduce himself and welcome you in a minute. We're working with the law school's Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice, and you'll hear from its executive director, John Holloway, after Reverend Howard. The Public Safety Review and Outreach Initiative is conducting a comprehensive review of public safety at Penn. The goal of the review is to assess Penn's success in creating a physically and emotionally safe environment on campus and in the surrounding communities, while treating every person with equal dignity and respect, and in a way that prioritizes and promotes anti-racism, racial equality, and justice. The outcome of the initiative will be a report and recommendations we'll present to President Amy Gutmann, Executive Vice President Craig Carnaroli, and Provost Wendell Pritchett in the fall. Our report and recommendations will be based on two main efforts. First, we've already begun collecting and reviewing hundreds of documents from Penn's Division of Public Safety regarding a wide range of policies, procedures, and outcomes, including use of force, vehicle and pedestrian stops, complaints, budgets, transparency, and relationships with other policing agencies. The second part is why we're here today. We're holding a series of virtual hearings to receive input from members of the Penn and West Philadelphia communities on their experiences with Penn's Division of Public Safety and on their ideas and suggestions. The hearings are publicly available via live stream and recorded for future public access. Reverend Howard and I are both longstanding advocates of racial justice, and we approach our leadership of this initiative very seriously and independently. We have been given complete freedom to listen, to learn, and to make recommendations about public safety without any pressure from the university administration. Our aim is to move Penn toward achieving a vision of public safety that treats everyone with equal respect, in which everyone can feel physically and emotionally safe with a sense of equal belonging, and that centers racial justice. To be candid, many of us are finding it hard to go on with business as usual after the ongoing events in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where police officers shot an unarmed Jacob Blake in the back 7 times, and with uprisings continuing across the country. The work of reimagining public safety is more urgent than ever, and we're so grateful to everyone in the Penn and neighboring communities who are participating in this initiative. I'll now turn it over to co-presidential advisor, Reverend Chaz Howard.
Thank you, Professor Roberts. And thank you, everybody who's tuned in this afternoon. It means a lot that you've taken time to go on this journey with us, a journey that we hope ultimately leaves our university and our whole community better. And just to echo what Professor Roberts said, this whole process, we're committed to openness. We mean that in two ways. Openness from a range of voices, be it faculty, staff, and students, members of our Division of Public Safety, as well as folks who are all around our West Philadelphia and Philadelphia community, and that's been reflected thus far in these hearings. We're open to a range of perspectives and opinions around contemporary policing in America, and we not only are open to that, but we seek that. We've sought to have a range of expertise and a range of opinions. Simultaneously, we're open to this whole process. One of the words that has been a refrain of our journey has been transparency. And so we wanted to do our best to make sure that anyone who wanted to listen in could, live or recorded. And so all of these hearings have been as transparent as we can make them. And likewise, we've been available via email, via phone call, and just via being pulled aside too. We'd like to add our gratitude to the Quattrone Center, who's done so much of the heavy lift for this, a lot of the busy work behind the scenes and pulling together the paperwork and inviting our guest speakers and just making sure the technology and the website and everything is working. So sincere gratitude from both Professor Roberts and I. And with that, I'd like to turn over to the director of the Quattrone Center, our friend John Holloway.
Thank you, Reverend Howard, and thank you, Professor Roberts. It's a privilege for us to be part of this process, and we appreciate the kind words. I'm John Holloway. I'm the executive director of the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. And I want to extend on behalf of my colleagues our sincere welcome to the members of the Penn community from whom we'll be hearing today, and to those who are watching and sending in questions online in this, which is the fifth in our ongoing series of public hearings in this Public Safety Review and Outreach Initiative. As these hearings continue, we're learning more and more about the many ways that our Division of Public Safety interacts with the Penn community, broadly defined to include both the campus itself and West Philadelphia more broadly. As Professor Roberts said, I think the tragedy of the shooting of Jacob just underscores the challenges that we're having in our communities with these issues and the importance that we be both transparent and compassionate with each other about the impact that that policing has in our communities, and that we realize that if they can happen in Kenosha and Ferguson and Minneapolis and Philadelphia, that they can also happen here. Each person who has participated in these conversations has provided a valuable and unique perspective, not just in terms of what our current relationship with the Division of Public Safety is today, but in terms of what that relationship could be or should be, and what we can do in the future to optimize those relationships to truly create an environment where all members of the community feel physically and emotionally safe at Penn. The last hearing, which took place last Thursday, August 27th, provided insight into the different ways that different parts of DPS administer assistance to the Penn community. We heard from Tamara Greenfield King and Sharon Smith from the Office of the Vice Provost for University Life, and also heard from Dean Sarah Bachman of the School of Social Policy and Practice, and professors Greg Ridgway, David Abrams, and David Rudofsky from the Penn faculty. If you were unable to participate in the live web stream, you can go to www.pennpublicsafetyreview.org and hear the full conversations and question and answers from that, as well as all of the other hearings. And we are also adding written transcripts for each of those hearings as they become available. Today, we're going to hear from a variety of university voices. We will start with Reverend William Gibson, the Associate Vice Provost for Equity and Access, formerly Penn's chaplain and the faculty member at the W.E.B. Du Bois House. In his role as the AVP for Equity and Access, Reverend Gibson oversees programs that guide and support scholars of all ages and backgrounds, and he oversees 4 resource centers that celebrate Penn's cultural diversity: the McCoo Black Student Union Center, La Casa Latina, the Pan Asian American Community House, and the Greenfield Intercultural Center. We'll also hear from Dr. Valerie Dorsey Allen, a longtime member of the Penn community as both a student and administrator, and currently the director of Penn's African American Resource Center. Both Reverend Gibson and Dr. Allen have been invited to share a brief opening statement one at a time, and once each of them has spoken, we'll engage with Professor Roberts and Reverend Howard in a question and answer session. From there, we'll turn to 2 leaders within Penn's Counseling and Psychological Services, or CAPS. We'll hear from Dr. Michal Saraf, the Senior Clinical Director, and Dr. Batsirai Bunzawabaya, the Director of Outreach and Prevention Services. Once again, each speaker will provide some opening remarks, and then we'll turn to our co-chairs for a question and answer period. The ground rules for the hearing are the same as those for prior hearings, but they should be briefly restated. We are recording this webinar. We will post the recording and a transcription of it on the Public Safety and Reviews website, which, as I said before, is www.pennpublicsafetyreview.org. Anyone in the audience is encouraged to submit questions at any time using the Q&A feature on the bottom of the screen. We are monitoring the Q&A. Given the time constraints that we have, we may not be able to address every question in full today, but we are keeping a record of the questions and will strive to answer them to the extent possible. We appreciate, actually, given the emotional nature of these conversations, I think the community has really been exemplary in its participation in this. We ask that members continue to keep their questions topical and appropriate, and appreciate that has happened in the past. And with that, I'll turn it back to Professor Roberts, Reverend Howard, and our first speaker, Reverend Gibson.
Reverend Gibson, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, all of you. Let me apologize in advance if I'm not projecting well enough, or if with these technical difficulties you can't hear me. I'll make an effort to make adjustments. Thanks to all who've helped to organize this opportunity for community conversation, information sharing, deep reflection, and consideration, some next steps to continue in the process of improving our community and in advancing the work of the DPS with ever-increasing attention to all members of the Penn and West Philadelphia neighborhoods, of which we're all a part. I want to begin by sharing that, like many of you, I took time this weekend to listen to presentations and speeches and to watch programs commemorating the 57th observance of the historic March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom that was organized by Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, Anna Arnold Hedgeman, Dorothy Height, and many others, at which Dr. King gave a speech that has become an exemplar of American oratory and of American aspirations, generally known as the I Have a Dream speech, but many, including myself, heard it as a speech about reparations. He mentioned the phrase police brutality 2 times. King said that America can never be satisfied as long as Black Americans continue to be the victims of unspeakable horrors of police brutality. Dr. King, in his soaring rhetoric, also talked about people of goodwill. It is those 2 things, people of goodwill and police brutality, that center my thoughts in the brief moments allotted to me. One of the beautiful things about the University of Pennsylvania is that it is peopled by many of goodwill. Among our students, undergraduate, graduate, professional, as well as faculty, staff, administrators, and members of the West Philadelphia community, we have an abundance of people of goodwill. It includes the Division of Public Safety, our allied guards, people of goodwill overflow at the University of Pennsylvania. Which is why when we have incidents in which there are negative interactions between members of the Penn community who are not members of the police force and members of the police force who are also members of our community, we all sit up, pay attention, ask ourselves, what has gone wrong here? What might we do better? I've had the good privilege in the over 2 decades I've been at the University of Pennsylvania to work with the Division of Public Safety, and now our Vice President for Public Safety, Maureen Rush. A couple of instances where these situations where there have been charges of police brutality or overreach, the Vice President has responded with goodwill. There are 2 reviews of which I served as a member and reviewed with others, not only the particular incidents, but what did these incidents teach us about how policing can happen better, that everyone in the community will feel that they are included and respected. Out of that has come a lot of good work. I know you have read about, those of you who are paying close attention, everything from the kind of training that reminds our officers of implicit bias to matters related to how members of the community, especially those who are Black, especially those who are brown, feel whenever they're in the presence of a police officer, no matter his, her, or their race. The intentionality of the work of the Division of Public Safety to continue to improve itself in its engagement with its community, both the university proper and West Philadelphia, is not without some incidents where we're reminded the work must continue, that people of goodwill cannot give up the good fight. I'm reminded also of the extraordinary work of Ibram Kendi, who many of us have been reading of late, which he talks about the difference between being non-racist and anti-racist. For this particular work that Dr. King referenced even 57 years ago, it continues. It continues in Kenosha, it continues in Minneapolis, it continues in Philadelphia, it continues in my home state of Louisiana, from which my father traveled. In 1963, I was too young to go along to the March on Washington. His entire trip there with 2 of his friends, in later years he described to me, was both exhilarating and frightful, for he felt on the route to Washington, he and they could be stopped at any time and the worst things happened. But my father was a man of hope and of goodwill. And I'm convinced that if we continue at this work of being a people of goodwill, we can address this problem, but we won't get it done by ignoring it. Finally, in my opening remarks, I'm reminded of what my mentor in higher education administration taught me some years ago. Dr. Ruth Simmons was in a significant leadership position at Princeton University after the Rodney King incident and the Simi Valley verdicts. On the way that only she could do, she rallied the goodwill at Princeton University and came up with a report that was handed over to President Shapiro. And everyone lauded her for the report about how to improve things like police-community relationships, especially in reference to Black and brown bodies, and what happens in classrooms, and what happens late at night, and who's included and who's excluded. And the magisterial, Dr. Ruth Simmons, nodded and said, "That is all good, but it doesn't matter at all if people don't feel differently, if they don't feel that they're respected, if they don't feel that they are honored." I'm convinced we have enough people of goodwill at the University of Pennsylvania to get us closer to that place where people will feel respected, they will feel honored, they will feel welcomed. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Gibson. Can we turn now to Dr. Valerie Dorsey Allen from the African America Resource Center?
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to offer testimony at this hearing. I'm an alum of the School of Social Policy and Practice, where I received MSW and DSW degrees. My mother was also an alum and worked at the university. I did my middle school homework at Van Pelt. I often say I grew up at Penn and I feel a great sense of belonging and connection to the Penn community. My exposure as a child, a student, an alum, and a lecturer have given me a unique and deep understanding of the terrain of Penn. In my role as the director of ARC, I've had the privilege and responsibility of hearing reports of faculty, staff, and students who have felt what they describe as the sting of racial and social injustice on and around Penn's campus. The missions of public safety and the African American Resource Center start similarly by saying our mission is to enhance the quality of life of our communities. I feel very privileged to have a relationship of trust and support with Vice President Rush, who says it's all about relationships. ARC also enjoys a strong relationship with Penn's Division of Public Safety. My office participates in an interview process for new officers, and we speak with all new recruits during their introductory period. While these relationships and activities make me feel comfortable and safe, when my teenage son is on campus, I still give him warnings. You see, he looks like any other Black teenage boy. He doesn't have a sign that says, "I am not a threat." I make sure he knows Vice President Rush's name and that he knows how to respond if stopped by the police. I, like every parent of a Black child, have given the talk that I hope will get my child home alive at the end of the day, even from a trip to Penn's campus. I, like many members of the Penn community, am outraged by the killing of members of the Black community nationwide by police officers. The most recent shooting of Jacob Blake and the manner in which he was shot in the midst of protests calling for police reform leaves my community feeling unheard, unimportant, uncared about, and unsafe. While we have not had such a tragedy at Penn, it is important to remember that Penn does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in the middle of everything that is happening. It exists in a racist America where Black and brown people still have the highest infant mortality rates, the highest COVID mortality rates, and the highest arrest and conviction rates. The Black and brown people that come to Penn's campus feel as unsafe as our brothers and sisters feel in Minneapolis, Louisville, Kenosha, and across the country. I know this because my Penn clients tell me this. Our public safety officers must keep in mind the impact their uniforms have on Black and brown people when they come in contact with them, or when they ask why they are on campus, or when they ask a Black or brown student studying for ID. There must be greater transparency of policy and practice of our public safety department, and more involvement by Black and brown communities and the West Philadelphia community in advising and on the advisory board. It is all about relationships, but it's not just on public safety. Relationships must change across campus. ARC works very closely with campus partners such as the Netter Center and Penn Women's Center. These departments, among others, reach out to provide support and access to the campus. We have to offer more of that type of engagement, and it is necessary to ensure that everyone knows what is being done. I am aware of a number of wonderful initiatives being done by various departments, including public safety, but many on campus and in the community are unaware. These civic engagement activities fit in with Ben Franklin's thoughts about education. According to Harkavy and Hartley, Franklin thought that education must be accessible across all social strata, and that a central purpose of higher education was service to society. If we are fulfilling our founder's mission, We must provide educational access and supports for success to diverse communities. We must also insist that our students in all departments are involved with civic engagement. Beyond civic engagement, some colleges and universities are requiring an anti-racism course. Because racism is insidious, an ongoing anti-racism training program for the campus as well as public safety officers is needed. Martin Luther King Jr. said racism is a philosophy based on contempt for life. Racism is total estrangement. It separates not only bodies, but minds and spirits. Inevitably, it descends to inflicting spiritual and physical homicide upon the outgroup. We must put an end to the bloodletting in Black and brown communities, especially those shootings and murders perpetrated by the police. We must support those protesting those activities. Finally, we must reprioritize our funding to provide additional social service, educational, health, and outreach programs for the community. There is a way for both police funding and social service funding to exist together. We must find ways to make Dr. King's dream of a beloved community a safe and respectful reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you, for those very helpful statements. And Reverend Howard and I would now like to ask you some questions to explore those statements some more. So I'll start with Reverend Gibson. Thank you for joining us and for your time. And you should know that we were able to hear you perfectly well. So no technological problems. So you mentioned that you served on 2 committees that dealt with public safety at Penn, the Ad Hoc Committee on Racial Profiling in 2004, and the Ad Hoc Committee on Safety in a Diverse Environment later that same year. And that you addressed the questions, what has gone wrong and what might we do better? So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about why there was a need for those committees, whether you've seen any changes that have occurred as a result of the work of your committees. And you also said that the work must continue. And so I wondered what specifically you meant. What lessons could we draw from your work, the results of your work on the committee, and what work we still need to do?
Thank you for those questions, Dr. Roberts. I'll attempt to answer them. For the first review committee, that came about as a result of a member of the community who was living in the quad with his family. And he was doing some work related to bicycle repair, if I remember this correctly. It's been some time ago. Mm-hmm. Of course, I wasn't there, but apparently he was really physically accosted by police officers. And that set off great alarm for many throughout the university.
If I may just ask, and these were Penn police officers?
Yes, that is correct. Thanks for that clarifying question. I think he took advantage of the internal processes within Penn Police, but that really wasn't satisfactory. What we realized was that it wasn't just that incident. Given the long history of what I learned when I came to Penn over 2 decades ago, and I keep saying that it might be closer to 3 in a few years, 3 decades, there had been quite a bit of friction from these kinds of incidents between members of the West Philadelphia community proper and the university. And this felt to many people like that, even though this gentleman was a member of the Penn community. He was Black and he was physically assaulted. And it seemed important for the administration at that time that there be a committee, a commission set up to look at not only that incident, but what is it that we could do as a university to make sure we were learning all the lessons from that and what we could do to improve going forward. So that was the first incident as much as I can recall of that. Out of it came what we generally call then diversity training. I tip my hat to the Vice President for Public Safety. She found a wonderful faculty member, Dr. Elijah Anderson, who committed quite a bit of time to working with her and with the command leadership and the rank and file around these kinds of issues of the relationships and interactions between police officers and members of the community, again, especially those who are Black and who are brown. And for several years after that, there were regular diversity trainings led by Dr. Anderson. And based upon my conversations with him, as well as with the vice president, those seem to be fruitful opportunities for our men and women who wear the uniform on campus. The second incident, I think, was related to one of our students who was misidentified as someone who had committed a crime on campus. At that time, I had begun my work as faculty director at Du Bois College House, and some students came to my door and knocked on the door, and they said, "Reverend Gibson, this terrible thing is happening to this student. What should we do?" And so I was able to contact public safety, and we began the conversation about getting just the facts. What happened? Ultimately, I want to be very clear. The student had not committed any crime. He fit a description. And like Dr. Allen, this is where often our great concern comes from. I'm the father of 2 daughters, but thank God I have 1 grandson, and I've already told him at the age of 11 the lesson that even though you are a part of the Penn community, he's growing up here, you are a young African-American boy. And the fact that this happened to one of our undergraduate students led us, I believe, to the next commission to learn, well, what is it we need to do better? I think one of the things that came out of it, if it didn't come out of the first, Dr. Roberts, was that for each college house, there's a liaison from Penn Police Department. We have at Du Bois a wonderful detective who's been with us over 15 years. We invite him in at the beginning of every school year, so all the first-year students in Du Bois meet him, they know his name. We invite him to every activity. He has carte blanche in this place. He comes in his regular clothes. He doesn't wear his uniform. He's not armed. He talks to students about whatever they want to talk about. He's helped students who are soon to graduate to figure out some of the offers for dwelling in other cities. He's known about scams in some of these cities and have saved students, now our alums, money. These kinds of relationships fall in the bucket of goodwill. This represents for me DPS's efforts to really build on goodwill and make it not an incident, but an ongoing relationship. So it's a bit long-winded there, but I hope I answered your questions. I'm sorry.
Thank you for your answer. Let me let Reverend Howard follow up.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for the time that you've given us today, but also the work you've done in the past on different committees. I know you've been a part of much of the training, and And I think that you are uniquely positioned to speak about several things. I want to ask two specific questions. I know that you've lived in Philadelphia for about 24 or 25 years, on campus in Du Bois, but also off campus downtown. So I have two questions. The first question is, has your experience been different with Philadelphia police versus Penn police? And if so, how? And then the second question is more to your role here at the university with oversight of the cultural centers. I wonder if you could speak to the tension around the way you use the word feel in your remarks, the way that sometimes in the moment, being around police officers makes different populations feel, and yet the need for public safety presence. And so by that, I think about the example you gave around Du Bois, around the detective or the officer who's been close to Du Bois, how every year you invite him, I presume, in to dinners and different events. Do you think our students would feel differently about that this year? Do you think, would it feel different if a different number of DPS went to Maku, Akasa, Patch, and all the other centers? Would be, not to ramble in the question, but I think we've heard from different spots that people, they don't want public safety. They don't want cops coming around this year. Cultural centers and some religious hubs who don't want them there because of a fear of danger, or B, just kind of like the triggering trauma that people feel. And yet there's this tension of, but things are happening and we need public safety around, some would believe. So the first question would be the difference between Penn police and Philly police. The second question is this tension of kind of a triggering trauma, yet needing to be policed.
If you don't mind, Chaplain, Vice President Howard, I want to focus really on the latter, if I might, and I will address the first. Yes, I will say unequivocally, students have made it clear to me and others in leadership positions at Du Bois that they don't want police presence in the building this year. And it's all connected with what has happened over this past spring, in particular, without a question. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and what happened in Kenosha recently. I think this is where I really pay attention to the language of both Kendi and of Dr. Angela Davis, that being non-racist is just not enough in this moment. It's never been enough. But especially in this time, it's important for police departments to be anti-police brutality. It's not to say that they haven't been that, but it's important that they make it clear that they are. That this is a time when standard procedure sounds very cold and as if those in law enforcement are deaf. So for example, for Jacob Blake, for him to be restrained in a hospital bed while he's paralyzed, and to have one of the law enforcement officers to answer the question by saying that standard procedure, I don't think that's a police department that's going to get good grades for anyone who's concerned about how people actually feel. I'm not a police officer, but I do know any institution human beings have created, human beings can change to make it more affirming of humanity. I'm very clear about that. So the students are very clear about this year. They have those who have developed relationships with the detective. I think they will maintain that relationship out of Du Bois. I think some of them will probably, if they haven't already, talked to him about some of these things that have happened, that have resulted in the loss of life. less attention to myself, but I'll say this as a way of answering the first part of your question, Dr. Howard. I said to Vice President Rush and others some years ago, to be an African-American man of the age that I am now, there are only 2 law enforcement departments I have any trust in. One is in my home state of Louisiana, when one of my cousins was the sheriff. He's Black like me, and the Penn Police Department. That just fix things around the edges is not enough. It should not be the case that a man in my age can say that and cannot say more. I only have confidence in 2 police departments, the Penn Police and the Sheriff's Department in my hometown when my cousin was the sheriff. We have to make sure there are real structural changes so everyone can say, I really believe that public safety is there for me, not to police my being. Thank you.
Can I ask one follow-up question?
Yes.
I'm moved by what you just said there. And I think there's consistency for a lot of people who feel that way. What is it about our Division of Public Safety that makes you trust them? Is it the people? Is it sort of relationships you've had with VP Rush for so long, with Kemp Fink and Fisher and like everybody who we've known for long? Is it these relationships, or is it something about the structure, or is it because of your standing here, or is it something else?
Thank you for that question, that follow-up question. First of all, I feel that way about the Penn Police Department because I do trust the people in leadership. And because they have responded over the decades in changing some of their structure, that gives me more reason to say what I said and to believe what I believe that I just shared with you. But I'm also very much aware of my position within the University of Pennsylvania. And I am uneasy about the fact that if it would take in a hard situation for me to pull out my PIN card and my relationship with our wonderful vice president to perhaps interrupt a situation that's going to go badly in which I'm going to get profiled. But that kind of thing is not available to every other person who looks like me. We still have a problem around the structure. It should not depend on personal relationships as much as I cherish them and I'm grateful for them over all these years.
So if I can follow up on that, then it sounds as if something more needs to be done. What is that we can recommend to President Gutman and Provost Pritchett that still needs to be done? Because it sounds as if you're saying that the Penn Police are more trustworthy than the vast majority of police departments in the nation, but you still aren't sure that someone who doesn't have the right ID, the right relationship, and is a Black person on campus would not be treated the way that perhaps the incidents that have happened in the past have occurred. And so what would it take for everyone to feel welcomed, honored, and respected, to use your really powerful terms in your opening statement?
Right. Thank you, Dr. Roberts. I think one of those things, and I think Dr. Allen mentioned it, is to invite members of the West Philadelphia community who are not employees at the university to be a part of the advisory council or committees such as the one that I served on along with others. That it will bring a certain kind of integrity and help to build the kind of trust where people actually believe that they are being heard. I also think it really will be important that when there are charges of police overreach or mistreatment, that there too we hear voices of people from the community. It cannot remain just a kind of internal decision. It has to include, when we say we serve all of West Philadelphia, I think it has to be reflected in the ways that we address redress when people feel that they have been harmed. So those are two things that come to mind immediately for me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. That's very, very helpful. So let's move on to Dr. Allen. Thank you so much for your statement and for your time with us today. I guess I want to begin with a very similar question we ended up with Reverend Gibson, because there were some parallels, I thought, in both of your statements. So you also mentioned that you've heard reports from faculty, staff, and students who have felt, to use your words, a sting of racial and social injustice on and around Penn's campus. And you also mentioned, as Reverend Gibson said about his grandson, that you have given warnings to your own teenage son about possible encounters with the police on campus. But you also said you feel privileged to have a relationship of trust, like Reverend Gibson said. So can you say some more about what might seem like a disconnect, and we've heard it from others who've spoken as well, that they feel a close or trusting relationship with the Division of Public Safety, especially Vice President Rush, but yet have heard or even experienced instances of racial profiling, or a sense of not being welcome, a sense of even fear of what might happen with the Penn police on campus. Can you help us work through, what are these experiences you've heard of? What is it that makes several people say they felt they've had to tell their Black child to be careful on Penn's campus?
So I've seen Black people stopped at Penn and questioned about why they're there.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, as I said, my son is a dreadlocked Black teenage boy,
Mm-hmm.
who wears his pants lower than I would like,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore sometimes fits the description. And so and more, our students also look like that. And so, you know, I talk to students and they talk about making sure they have on Penn gear so that they don't call as much attention. They shouldn't have to feel that way. And so I saw this sign that on one of the social media sites that said, stop telling us that not all police officers are bad and start telling police officers that not all Black people are.
Mm-hmm.
So I have trust, and Will Gibson said goodwill. I really believe that Vice President Rush and the leadership at Division of Public Safety operate out of goodwill. I trust that if there is an incident, if I contact them, that it will be handled appropriately and quickly. Somehow or another, some things have to trickle down to the officers who are on the beat so that they don't have missteps. One of the incidents that I referred to was students who were studying in a building that was closed. They didn't realize that the building was closed. The police officers were called. They came in. um, at the ready, and, asked for the student's ID. The students complied and left, but they left feeling very afraid, and they shouldn't have to feel that way. They have ID. They're in a building that you couldn't get in without the ID. Why were they made to feel that way? And so we have to somehow get the word to the officers on the beat that it doesn't have to be so confrontational. One of the things I talked about was, and right from Maureen Rush, is it's all about relationships. And so I think it is so important that police officers and students and faculty and staff know each other before incidents happen. Because I think if you know people before it happens, things don't happen. When you see people, I heard Eric Grimes, who was on Word Radio, talk about the word respect. And he said, when you give respect, it's to take a second look, to re-inspect. And when you do that, you can see someone's humanity and not just what you're looking at with your first sight. And so you have to take the time to do that before you interact so that you can have an appropriate interaction. And I think that, I know we already do training, but I think additional training would help. And again, something that I said, we are doing all kinds of programs to open out to the community and support the community. Who are we telling? Who are we telling that public safety runs the PAL office? Who are we telling those things to? We need to make sure that people know what is happening.
Thank you.
Let's have a few questions, Dr. Allen. Thank you so much again for taking the time to be with us and for your long time support and care for our community. I think the first question is around, I've known you a long time. I did not know about you doing your homework in Van Pelt or anything like that. You've seen Penn for a while. Are we getting better around this, around policing, around Penn Police relationship with our campus, with us? Are we getting better at that?
So I think that we are, but I think it's important to understand trauma. So my research is in trauma. And one of the things that we know is that most people will not see someone get shot. They will not see a police officer brutalize somebody. Most people won't see that. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but most people won't see it. But when you hear about something happening over and over and over again, my research shows that you are as traumatized as if you witnessed it. So therefore, when you are, I think we are getting better because of everything that is happening around us. It's not going to feel that way. And so you have to go above and beyond so that people can begin to feel more of a sense of comfort.
Thank you. Thank you. And speaking of trauma, I know that you've been present for a lot of the really hard moments in the lives of members of our community, just directly in your role as a caregiver and a therapist and then counselor here. We haven't heard a whole lot about our special victims unit at Public Safety. Could you speak to your experience with them when, and I don't say this flippantly, when sexual violence has occurred, interpersonal violence has occurred? How has your experience and interaction with that aspect of Penn Police and public safety gone?
I think that the officers who are in special victims are very well trained, very responsive. Their training goes beyond police training. They have I've seen them walk victims through a process of going to court and getting resolution to issues. And I've seen them do that with empathy and in a way that makes the person feel comfortable sharing. And that doesn't always happen because a lot of times people can be made to feel shame or feel responsible for what happens. But they have done a good job of providing officers and the training to those officers to support victims who they come in contact with. I feel very comfortable calling them.
Again, just one last question. I'm not sure if you can speak to this. I know that your office is front line for taking care of Black staff and faculty members on campus. How do you think the Black staff members of public safety are doing?
So I have had a couple of members of public safety staff who have felt that they were mistreated in some ways. What is unfortunate is that they didn't want to go any further. They just wanted to be able to talk about. And let me just say this. Many people come to our office and they say, I just need some help figuring out how to respond, what to do. I don't want to go any further. So it's not unique to public safety, but they just feel like I just need to know how to get through this without losing my mind and without thinking I'm crazy. And so I spend time in those incidents just kind of validating what they have been through and helping them to strategize about how to move through.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. I just want to ask another question, because you did bring up some really helpful recommendations, which are so useful to us. Reverend Gibson also endorsed your recommendation of more involvement by neighboring West Philadelphia community members in advising or having other involvement in policies and practice. But one I wondered if you just say a few more words about was also your comment that we should reprioritize funding to provide additional social services, educational health and outreach programs. And I wondered if you saw a way that some of the funding for police might be invested in these programs, and whether you were referring to programs in the West Philadelphia community, programs on campus, both. Just a little bit more about what you had in mind about this question of investment of Penn's funds.
I was speaking at that moment to programs in the West Philadelphia community. Mm-hmm. I had a coworker who grew up in the bottom and was displaced by the university. The university sits in the middle of a community. Mm-hmm. And it's real important that we have all of these resources, that we provide access to the community, to those resources. How do we have schools where only 6% are graduating, being able to do math at a 12th grade level? Or schools where there's no one graduating on grade level that are right in West Philadelphia, where you have University of Penn, Drexel University, and University of Sciences right there. And that just is outrageous to me. When I think about, I went to Philadelphia public schools, I went to Lee School, and then I went to Overbrook, and I got a good education. Would I send my children to Overbrook? Heck no. And that's heartbreaking. And we can do something about that. Same way with social service programs. One of the programs that the Netter Center does at SARE, they do a lot of health programs. They do mentoring programs. one of the alumni classes does a mentoring program at SARE. We need to have those kind of programs at every school in West Philadelphia, whether it's Penn or Drexel or Penn and Drexel together. We need to be providing those type of resources. In terms of, I was very careful about not saying that it should come from public safety funds. Still, I think there's a much larger discussion when they talk about how defunding and what that means for police departments. I personally don't at the moment think that that's the way to go. I think we need public safety, we need police officers, but I also think that we have some resources that we can share that would not involve us putting out a whole lot more than what we have.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Reverend Gibson. Thank you, Dr. Allen. We really appreciate your contributions, not just today, but over the long time of your association affiliations with Penn. Thank you very much. We'll turn to the second half of the hearing today with our colleagues from CAPS, and we'll start with Dr. Saraf, please.
Good afternoon. This conversation thus far has moved me beyond what I have words to express. So I am very grateful and humbled to be engaged with people of such tremendous thoughtfulness, understanding, and appreciation for engaging in the world in a meaningful way. I'm just in awe of all of you. So I want to name that, and in awe to be in your presence. So Professor Roberts, Vice Provost, and Reverend Howard, and members of the committee, I'm honored to be here today to participate in this important conversation. My name is Michal Nina Saraf. I'm the Senior Clinical Director at CAPS, and in this role, I'm charged with overseeing and managing our internal operations, where our diverse community of professionals strives to meet the mental health needs of our diverse student body. A deep and abiding commitment to social justice and multiculturally informed practice guides our decision-making and interactions at every turn. And I want to couch that just to let you know that I grew up in the 60s in San Francisco with activist parents and started at age 3, going to marches to protest the war in Vietnam and to march for social justice. My dad made movies about desegregation early on, and then we all got distracted and we lost our focus. And now I'm so excited that we're focusing back on this beyond important topic. Personally, I've been very privileged to build relationships with several members of Penn Public Safety, Special Services in particular, and to interact more broadly with a wider group of departmental professionals. These relationships were born and have grown on campus committees, during late night huddles at the police station in the wake of a student tragedy, during post-vention responses to students, during much needed and well-managed wellness checks for student safety, and during too numerous to count, phone, and it used to be in-person consultation. In the context of meetings, I have found colleagues who are thoughtful, wise, sensitive to individual student need, creative in devising support plans, and willing to go above and beyond to create safety nets for any given student. In my world, they have exemplified it takes a village. I have witnessed the same skills in the stressful moments before dawn, after a tragedy, and in the planning for holding students during postvention. We have held each other, and I have always witnessed sensitive people seeking to understand and respond to the range of human need and emotion in any given situation. I have partnered with officers working evening and night shifts as they thoughtfully check on students of concern. I have watched them display sensitivity to the students, be mindful of their power, the power that their role carries, and oftentimes guide highly troubled students towards a needed next step in a care plan. At the same time that I have enjoyed these very positive relationships and interactions with our public safety personnel, I am mindful of how people of color in our community may have different feelings about the police and feel re-traumatized by the very presence of police officers in our midst. I am mindful of the difference between my experience walking the streets and that of some of my colleagues, students, supervisors, and friends. I am mindful of the fear that grips many individuals and families. We are witnessing violence perpetrated by police departments against Black identified people in our country on a regular basis and receive daily reminders of how we have two justice systems, one for white people and one for Black people and other people of color. I am eager to discover the best ways we as a campus community can learn to respond to these very present and legitimate concerns. I think now, in the moment where we are operating remotely, from the CAPS perspective, we used to rely on a wide network of partners within the community when we had concerns about students. We could have someone gently check in on someone we were worried about in the dorms, whether it be an RA or a GA, or a house dean, or a friend that we identify through our many partners. We don't have that anymore. So now we rely on public safety, and it points to the tension that has been mentioned by many of my colleagues previously, that we need the support of a public safety department. We're also aware that in this moment, their very presence, particularly in these sensitive moments, even in light of their extensive training, may be upsetting and traumatizing and re-traumatizing for the very people that they are trying to assist. And right now, that involves very few students living on campus. Most of the students who have rejoined our community are living in off-campus settings. So that is something that I think about as we moved into the semester of how can we name that, plan for that, and create a way to respond to safety concerns that is gentle and that brings people the comfort and the next steps that they may require in any given situation. So that's a very specific concern that I have in my role here at the Counseling Center, because we're all remote, so there is a gap there. In summary, I am grateful for and proud of the collegial relationships I enjoy here at Penn with our partners in public safety. Broadly defined, their relationships replete with respect, open communication, eagerness to collaborate, and willingness to teach and learn. Of utmost importance to me, these people always have humor, compassion, and show a very gentle vulnerability. However, we face a huge problem on a systemic level, and I am eager to participate in conversations that may lead to greater understanding on this front in the service of building true justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we would turn now to Dr. Bunza-Wabaya, please.
Thank you for having me here today. My name is Dr. Batsirai Bunza-Wabaya, and I'm the Director of Outreach and Prevention Services at CAPS, and I'm also a staff psychologist there as well. In my role at CAPS, I, along with my colleagues, provide individual and group therapy, where we often hear the historical and daily experiences of our students. We also provide workshops and trainings that are aimed at increasing mental health awareness, reducing stigma, and connecting students to community and campus resources that include the Division of Public Safety. I wanted to center my statements around the well-documented impact of racialized violence and racism on the psychological and emotional well-being of our Black communities. The American Psychiatric Association noted that perceived racism and discrimination, either overt or covert, or in the forms of implicit or explicit bias, have been associated with depression, anxiety, increased substance use, feelings of hopelessness, and suicide ideation in Black adults and youths. After a law enforcement involved shooting of a Black or brown person in the US, such as Breonna Taylor and most recently Jacob Blake, what usually follows are painful reactions from some of our students. We usually see students in therapy who are sad, scared, angry, hopeless, and disheartened by the images and news stories that now dominate many of their thoughts as they're simultaneously engaging with their classes. Quite simply put, we often see signs of racial trauma. For some students, these experiences propel them to take action to advocate for justice. For others, it awakens previous traumas and mental health concerns. And for some, they're just unsure how to make sense of their emotions and regain their balance. These students experience anxiety around how to interact with their peers, faculty and staff, but most importantly for our discussion today, how to interact with Penn Police. Due to the confidential nature of my work, I'm unable to share identifying details. With respect to the privacy of our students, I will provide broad themes that I hope will shed some light on negative student experiences with DPS. These accounts are reflections from students of color, LGBT+ students, international students, and students from low-income backgrounds. There are instances specific to wellness checks when students awaken to the presence of uniformed law enforcement. The intention of DPS is to ensure their safety, but the impact of this unexpected presence can be a significantly alarming sight to wake up to. During these perceived emergencies, we will request the police officer's support and involvement. Consequently, these specific types of intervention heighten distrust with vulnerable students and increase a sense of being surveilled or being unsafe, and enhance uncertainties of what could happen with Penn Police involvement. In another example, students of color expressed the need to wear Penn-affiliated sweaters as a form of protection at the bookstore or while studying late at night in one of the buildings on campus. In one incident, a student became tearful after they were described as being part of a gang after a verbal disagreement in their friend group resulted in law enforcement presence. Research shows that African American males are at great risk of developing symptoms of anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of being perceived of wrongdoing by law enforcement due to their race. In our trainings, we often encourage students, faculty, and staff to contact Penn Police in a life-threatening emergency, as we know how many lives Penn Police have saved. Yet some students report being hesitant to call the Penn Police on a Black or brown student experiencing a mental health crisis and ask what other alternatives may be available. These concerns are real, and they come from the lived experience of the students. I think we need to listen to these concerns, and I'm grateful for this forum to do so. I would now like to share the work currently taking place between CAPS and DPS. When I think of DPS, the names that come to mind are Perdita Watson, Patricia Brennan, Tracy Cardella, and Paige Wigington from Special Services. They serve as one of our main referral sources on the Sexual Trauma Treatment Outreach and Prevention Team, also known as STOP. They assist us and our students navigate various legal and health systems. After Take Back the Night, they're not only present to support our students, but they offer us rides home and check in on us after the event. This partnership has been invaluable in our work. We also rely on Penn Police for the services they provide via the helpline, providing transportation to the emergency room, and in the rare event where one of our therapists is physically unsafe in our building. Penn Police can respond via panic buttons within minutes. The need for collaborative relationships is vital for the work that we do. During the transportation to inpatient care for our students experiencing a mental health crisis, most times students are scared. At times they're not sure who to trust, but they're desperately needing of our help. We often hear that students have felt supported by Penn Police during these times. The importance of relationships and community building is recognized in the mission of DPS. And like the therapeutic relationship, the need for empathy, trust, and collaboration is imperative. As we highlight the significance of the physical safety of our students, we should also recognize and focus on fiercely protecting our students' emotional and psychological safety as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, both of you, for your very insightful comments about the relationship between CAPS and public safety. Let me begin in order then with Dr. Saraf. And there's still this theme that is just so vivid to me throughout the day, today, of the positive relationships that some of you have mentioned with public safety, but then the issue of the very presence of Penn Police being traumatizing to some of our students. And Dr. Saraf, you mentioned specifically that you've had these very positive relationships, but you're mindful of how people of color in our community, at Penn and perhaps the neighboring communities, can feel re-traumatized by the very presence of police officers. And so I wondered if you'd say some more about, you expressed a concern, and so I wonder if you could say more about your concern. Have you heard from students about their sense of trauma? And then if it is possible to give us some guidance on how we should address this. Are there alternatives to the police involvement in your work that would be less traumatizing to students?
Thank you for your question. I think, as I said, outside of COVID, we have a lot of alternatives, and we use them very regularly. We have the SIS team, we have the whole infrastructure in campus houses, we have sometimes even faculty member advisors. We use, the great web of relationships that, when we do our work, we figure out what could be most helpful to this student. In the current time, I'm not sure what alternative resources we have. So it's a real quandary of how we can sort of broach the issue of safety and not create more lack of safety in our very, certainly what we're doing. I mean, what Botsi and her team are doing on the outreach effort is training people to, be more aware of their friends, anyone who might be in distress or, need support, so that people within communities can approach people who are suffering and try and get them connected to the right resources. So we certainly have that going on. I certainly would concur with my colleagues who have, spoken to increased training. There certainly is, increased training to make sure that people within the police ranks understand psychological needs, emotional needs of their constituents, and whether that's to add to the ranks of the police, social service trained individuals who can, respond to situations that, by nature are not in the law enforcement purview. If someone is suffering, they need someone who's trained psychologically to reach out and see if they're safe and see if they need any ongoing intervention. So I guess the question is, how does that happen within a Department of Public Safety, or how do we provide resources more broadly from the larger university, particularly during a pandemic, but even, during our regular, if we ever get back to our regular times. But I think the pandemic sort of hones in on that and says, where are the people with the psychological training who can make these kinds of interventions or these kind of check-ins?
Yeah, so I just want to be clear about what you're saying, because at one point it sounded like you were saying, could police be trained better in social services and psychology? And you seem to then move to perhaps there are people other than police who are trained in things who could do this kind of work.
Yeah, I think both and, I think the more that our police, and I think, as I said, my experience with Penn Public Safety is that their training is excellent, and generally in these emergency moments, they respond very well. That doesn't mean that students feel comfortable, however, for, the range of reasons that many people have named today. So then the question is, do we need another layer of professional who is not, a police officer, another layer of professional who, is more in line with the training that we have here at CAPS, who is available to interact with people who are in distress in a, from a different philosophy and vantage point.
Yeah, thank you.
Dr. Sroff, thank you so much for your comments. And I wanted to go in a slightly different direction with the questioning. Your thoughts on the psychological welfare and care of the members of Division of Public Safety. I know that, maybe I'm wrong, I know that the staff members in DPS aren't necessarily on your watch, but one can't help but kind of have the occasional organic kind of care moment with, so I'm not sure if you can speak to it, but broadly, how are police officers doing psychologically? And if you could speak to how our police officers in DPS are doing psychologically. I know that's a very amorphous term, but are you aware of the training they get or the support they get? Anything like that?
To be honest with you, I am not familiar with the specifics of their training or internal support. I only know what I see on the outside. I see the results of that training and their ability to interact, but I am not privy to the, I'm sorry to say, to the actual training and support structure,
Could you comment on what you see?
As I said, what I see are people who are, really, really dedicated to their work, who are really dedicated to expanding their understanding and their sophistication in responding to students in any given setting. My interactions are most frequently and specifically with members of special services. We interact, around issues of sexual assault or possible sexual assault. We interact, on committees to discuss students of very high concern. And I see individuals who are just extraordinary in their understanding and their willing to work and their willingness to collaborate. I think they're under a tremendous amount of stress. And I think they bear the stress with a lot of grace, but I think they hold a lot inside. So I think, acutely aware of that.
Thanks, Vic. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Wuzo Wabaya, please. And thank you so much for your comments and elaborating on the issue of racial trauma. It seemed to me as you were talking, and this is true, I think, about everything we've heard today, but it became clearer for me during your statement that the racial trauma from encounters with police come from a couple things. One is the police presence may be traumatizing to people because of what's going on around the nation with police violence. And then there may also be a trauma from negative encounters with the Penn police. And those are really two different things that our initiative needs to deal with. And so I thought it would be helpful if you could help us go through both of those a little bit more. So one is the trauma just from police presence, which may be due to violence outside of Penn's campus. But I don't think we can discount that it's actually causing alarm. You mentioned the alarming sight of police if when a student is undergoing some kind of crisis or need of mental health care and police officers are intervening instead of others that may be less traumatizing. And so I wondered, as I asked Dr. Saraf, if there are possibly alternatives to police intervening which would be less traumatizing to students. And then also if you could comment on what we might do about the other form of trauma where students actually have direct negative encounters with the Penn police.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. I think I'll start with the trauma that may take place outside of Penn police. Mm-hmm. I think this is really challenging because even if there is a difference between how Penn police operates and other departments across the country, again, if these are the images that our students are seeing constantly, how do they know the difference between the people who are on their campus and everybody outside of that campus? So it's really, really challenging. And I think definitely agree with trying to figure out both approaches. I think that the training for Penn police is really important so that if there are instances that are traumatic to students or anything that feels harmful in any way, that there is intentional repair around that. I think that's really important. I know sometimes there can be a process where maybe sort of on the back end, maybe the Penn police are getting feedback and things like that, but I feel like most often students don't know sort of what happens, right? So maybe they'll tell me, they'll tell other administrators, but they actually don't really know what happens next. They don't know if their concern was actually taken seriously. They don't know what remediation may have been given. And I understand that there may be complications to giving away a lot of that information. But in thinking about what the repair could look like on our campus, I think about, trauma-informed approaches where, there's collaboration, there's transparency. So I think an example of transparency, especially in talking about mental health, is how do we make sure that students understand what the connection is between CAPS and Penn police so that it's really laid out for them. Like if they are called, these are the things that could happen. I know that as a therapist, this is a conversation that I have, especially when I'm worried about a student, to say, listen, if I don't hear from you, their student intervention services, they might, reach out to you. And I think that's part of what's needed is do students really know what impact Penn police has for any of our offices, but especially in talking about CAPS, so that if they are ever in that situation or their friends are in those situations, they kind of understand what's going to happen. Because I think the uncertainty and lack of transparency around that may heighten the anxiety and a lack of safety. And I think, again, when the interactions happen between the students and Penn police, how much of that conversation is collaborative? So for instance, if a student is in a building, as Dr. Allen shared earlier, how much does the officer explain? Like, listen, we got this call, we wanted to check it out. How are you feeling now that, maybe we may have made a mistake here in assuming you're in this building? Like, how much does that conversation happen so that there is a corrective experience within that engagement with the officer, so they don't just sort of go their separate ways? And again, the student kind of gets reinforced, maybe a message that they don't belong there, maybe they're under suspicion for whatever reason, or maybe that if a similar thing happens with a different officer, they're like, oh, this has happened 3 or 4 times now. And again, what messages are they taking away from that? So as much as there can be, again, mutual respect, collaboration, transparency, I think is so important. And then I think in terms of the things that they may be witnessing, I think the statements that are made from each of our offices when racial trauma occurs outside of Penn or Philly, I think is so important. And yet at the same time, I think students may feel like it needs to be followed by action, which is why I think this conversation is so important, that it doesn't feel like it's just a lot of words. So then they learn to expect the emails, they learn to expect maybe sort of temporary acknowledgement, but then it slowly sort of goes away with time. And then until it happens again, then the statements come out again and they feel like, okay, well, what's really changing? And I think that can also be disheartening to students. I hope I answered both your questions within that.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, and to Dr. Saraf for just all you do every single day in caring for our community. I wanted to pose the same question that we shared with Reverend Gibson earlier around the complexity of a lot of our students naming their desire not to have police officers present in their cultural centers and college houses and their religious hubs and different spots. One, could you speak a little bit more to like why? Why is even the idea of Penn police officers sort of being in and around these spaces hard for some of our students, and maybe even Savin Feckenham for so why? And then 2, your recommendation of like, should we listen to that? Should the prevention of crime or activity supersede the feelings of our community members, or not necessarily erase them, but what should our response be, A, as Division of Public Safety, B, as a university, to that student request?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think just to make sure I get both parts of your question, you mentioned why it might be hard for a student to be in a shared space with a police officer. So starting with that question first, I think it's hard because for most students, they don't really know any of the officers by name or sort of personally. Maybe they might see the same face a few times, but there isn't like an intimate relationship within that. And I think going back to some of the comments that have been made, part of what has worked well in terms of my personal relationship with the folks in special services is because I really do feel like I know them, right? When I say to a student, you're gonna talk to Paige, I feel like it feels different to them, and they can hear in my voice and my tone and my demeanor that this is somebody I have interacted with. But if I was to give a recommendation for, another officer, like I've actually never really had a conversation with any of them. So I think in some ways they're also kind of watching us, like the people that they do trust, to see how we're behaving. And then we're sort of modeling for them, like our comfort level, which is why I think Dr. Allen's comments earlier, as well as Reverend Gibson, was so important. Because if we as staff or faculty feel uncomfortable, I think students are seeing that, they're learning from that. But I think when they think about what it feels like for them, I think it can feel like, they're kind of among strangers. And in some ways, as a therapist, maybe to a lesser extent, what I represent to students sometimes is something I have to be mindful of. Because again, maybe they've heard of therapists, as not being safe people. And it takes a lot of work in terms of being so present and trying to be on campus so that it kind of demystifies a little bit of who I am as well as my colleagues, but also making sure that they have some faith that I'm listening to the things that they're telling me, which is why I think some of the things that were shared earlier about Du Bois's liaison program are so important, because I hope that it kind of humanizes the people that they're working with, not just for the students, but on the other end as well. so that Penn Police can also feel like these are their students and they know them and they can recognize them, not because they're wearing a Penn t-shirt, but because they really know them as people. And I know that that feels hard given all the time demands we have, but I think that might be some of the work that's needed in terms of why students may still feel like maybe Penn Police are not welcome in their spaces because they just don't know them. And I think we can all kind of relate to that in terms of our sense of safety. We want to be around people we feel like we know, so that even if there is a rupture within the relationship, that they can actually address it with the police officers. Like, these are conversations that we want to kind of foster so that students can feel like they can address things head on, as opposed to maybe telling me, but really feeling like that's as far as they're willing to go, is they're going to tell me in therapy and that's it, or maybe other administrators on campus and that's it. So I do feel like it's almost like a culture shift that would need to take place. I'm trying to remember the second part of your question in terms of the suggestion. Is it that should we honor the suggestion for students? Is that what you asked?
Yeah, and I recognize that it's a decision a lot of people have to make, and we'd also need to take into account the students who really, really do want a police presence there. But maybe the better phrasing of it could be, what should our, as university's response be to that request of some of our students?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to maybe what I shared earlier a little bit, which is I think it has to be both, because even though I think sometimes I fall into this of sort of lumping students together, I think all the students sort of have different needs. And I wonder about, for the students who are saying they don't feel comfortable, is it because of the images they're watching on TV, or is it because of their personal experiences? Because if it is their personal experiences, the repair and the work is going to look a little different than if it's just saying, I don't trust any of them. It doesn't matter whether they're Penn affiliated or not. So I think even just understanding where that request is coming from more fully, and then really thinking about, if we still decide to say, they actually need to be present, then really having an open conversation with the students about why the university is deciding this. I feel like one of the things I've learned from being in an administrative position is we make a lot of decisions that I feel like are good decisions based on the conversations we're having behind closed doors, but we don't always communicate that as clearly with students. So even sometimes students will ask CAPS to do certain things, and I understand why they're requesting those things, but I realize in that moment that I haven't done a good job of actually explaining why I'm not able to honor whatever request they're giving us. So I would say a lot of dialogue might need to take place to not only understand the student needs, and then I'd also say even just the police officers' needs. Like, do they want to be there? Do they feel happy to be there? And then how do we also communicate that to the students, maybe even having them communicate that themselves? So even if they are present in that space, how are they interacting with students? Do they seem uncomfortable? Are they in a corner? Or are they just really actually, mixing with the students, asking them questions, getting to know them? So I think maybe what students might envision is, if they're there, they're just going to observe us. And then maybe in a way that doesn't feel safe. So I think, again, just really being intentional about what that presence looks like and understanding what that means for all the parties involved to have that presence in whatever space they're sharing in that moment. I hope I answered your question. I feel like it's like a therapist answer, which is like more dialogue needs to happen, understand what's happening. So
Great answer. Thank you so much.
Well, I think that those are our questions, unless Reverend Howard, you had others. I feel as if we got a lot of wonderful and helpful information from our panelists today. Thank you all for your contributions.
Yeah, thank you very much to all of our speakers and to our audience. For anybody whose questions were not answered, we have saved them and we will continue to take them into consideration as our review continues. We are in the process of scheduling our next hearing. We will be posting that on the website at pennpublicsafetyreviews.org. And we will post both the videotape of this hearing and the transcript of it as soon as they become available on the same place. So thank you all for a thought-provoking and insightful afternoon, excuse me. We look forward to next steps as this review continues. Be very well. Thank you.